Welcome everyone to this week's episode of the 5710 podcast. This week's guest is Victor Enrich, who is a painter and photographer and I suppose an artist in his own right. Welcome Victor, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Very
Happy
good.
to be here in the 57th parallel.
The first thing I'd like to ask you is whether websites like ArcDaily and Design and these websites where your work has been published, do you think there's an element of that's how we absorb these kind of artists these days in architecture? Do you think it's replacing libraries and architecture books and El Croquets, or do you think there needs to be a balance drawn there? What's your thoughts on that? The way architecture and design and artwork is published now, quite often we see it through photographs many times before we go visit something, and often we don't visit it.
Yeah, well, definitely the way how we communicate architecture in the recent years, it has changed a lot since previous times. When I used to study architecture at school, we mostly rely on books, booklets, magazines, and we went to libraries. It was like a completely different experience. But of course, with the arrival of the internet, things had to change, for good or for bad. In the end, it always, from my point of view, depends on the kind of magazine. I mean, they can be designed in different ways. Some are better designed, some are worse designed.
Some are pamphlets.
Some are pamphlets or full of rubbish, or they just, or the way they are internally organized.
Mm-hmm.
There are companies
Full of advertisements.
Full of even though there's a lot of browsers that they can just like skip you from watching all these ads and stuff like that. So in a way, I'm pretty cool with that. The only problem that I see is that probably maybe young people especially, are getting used to see more virtual architecture than real architecture. Mm-hmm. The use of renderings in these websites it's extremely high, and compared to the use of real pictures of real buildings, because it actually takes time to end a building, like 5 years, 3 years, but to make a 3D rendering, you could do it in a couple of hours if you want. So in the end, this can just give some confusion to architects or to young people watching these websites, because they maybe think that architecture is what they're being shown in these websites, not the real thing. So if it's still a little bit under control, it's all right, and there is a lot of curators behind that decide what stuff to publish and not. If there's that such control and quality control,
proper editing,
yeah. So in the end, it's up to the owners or the managers of those internet magazines to decide what to put or what not to put. It's anyway, we will see, because in the next 5 years, it could get even worse than it is today, or even better. I don't know.
It's interesting you mentioned that about architecture students seeing virtual buildings. Quite often you go into an architect's website and you will see projects that haven't been built or that were an entry for a competition they didn't win. And I mean, I suppose it's about getting your ideas out there, even if the ideas weren't successful. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Because before times, if a building wasn't built, often it's not going to be in a book published. Very, very rarely would you see a sketch of a building that didn't come into existence.
Yeah, definitely. And studios are using their own architecture to market the architecture they're doing. Virtual architecture to market eventual real architecture that they will do. And in a way, it's good, because it allows visitors to understand what's the line of work of that particular studio.
Shows progression perhaps as well.
But the real thing must be visited, must be seen, and that's when you really realize if that studio, that architect or that artist is really good or not. Because there's a big difference between a virtual image than a real building. There are huge differences, in the details, in the materials, in the problems that you have to face in order to keep the design, alive and not to destroy it.
The tactileness of it. You talked before in a previous interview about how you think architecture phases have gone. There's no more brutalism or modernism. It's brands, as we just mentioned there. Is that something that concerns you, and is that something you're concerned with, in your own work, about worried about being branded, or is it something you try not to think about?
Yeah, someone, I forgot his name, said that in architecture today there is more poets than poems. So, I mean, I don't think that there is a conspiracy behind this. You know, in the end, we are all victims of the market, and market, by meaning market, I mean the clients. You know, so if clients want a nipple in the middle of the mountain, and they need a name to build that nipple, they will look for him or her, and they will have their own magnificent nipple. What can an architect do against that? Especially if he or she is getting well paid for doing that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the end, you are calling a specific person to do a specific job for you.
Yeah.
You know, in the other hand, you find all the huge amount of anonymity works. You know, in a way, just go outside big cities, and it will be hard for you to recognize who is the author of that building or that other building, because they almost look quite the same. Mm-hmm. Mostly because they are just like victims of the regulations of the limits and stuff like that, you know. But those architects who did them, they didn't have no choice, because they were not called by anybody wanting a nipple in the middle of a mountain, you know. So it's like two realities living at the same time, and obviously most people would like to enjoy the first reality, where you can just like play around and get a lot of money and be famous, rather than struggle with silly demands from anonymous customers that don't have any culture of nothing. But that's the way it is.
I suppose, yeah, we think back, branded architects have been around probably quite a while. I imagine when people asked Mies van der Rohe to do a building, they were wanting a Mies van der Rohe building. Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose it's maybe not such a new thought as I think.
You can just like go to his tomb and just try to wake him up, and you will have a Mies van der Rohe building by his corpse, you know. But again, what can you do if somebody comes to you with that specific request?
That's true. Yeah.
You are just like,
if someone came to Monet and asked him to paint, it would be a Monet that would end up with it. It's a brand in its own way, even if it's.
It's up to you. It's your choice. It's your choice. You can always say no, thank you. I mean, I have my dignity, and I mean, for me, Mies van der Rohe, I didn't like it. I never liked it when I was at school.
No.
So no, not in my case.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the architect they were talking about. So I will never do a Mies van der Rohe like building, you know, for my convictions. You know.
Well, probably that brand probably falls into the talk about subjectivity and stuff like that. Yeah. Do you see your images and your photographies as perhaps portraits of buildings? Is that kind of how you?
Yeah,
especially the Tel Aviv Tower and things like that. You know, there's a character to them, and you're trying to explore the character, not in a character of a space, but character of a building as a life form in a city, perhaps. Yeah. Yeah,
totally. Actually, when I finished doing these pictures over the course of 6-7 years, and I had never packed them all together in a project. I just was working on them one after the other. But at the end of it, when I decided it had to be the end of it, I just put them in a group called City Portraits, you know, and because I thought that actually that's what they were. But why portraits? When you do a portrait of someone or somebody, you establish some kind of connection or relationship. You need to talk to that person. You need to drive that person into some sort of situations in which he or she is giving you the best or the worst of himself, you know, so that you can get the best picture of him, you know. I mean, that's stuff from photographers, and each photographer does it in his own way. You know, there's people who like to shoot portraits out on the street without asking permission. There is people who is asking people to come in their studios and prepare a space where to shoot them in a specific condition, and something like that. In my case, since I was too shy to ask people to make them portraits, and actually I had no interest at all, I actually did them on buildings, and for me, I just like tried to give them some sort of personality, to establish a connection with them, in order to somehow virtually they were allowing me to shoot them. But in the end, the portraits were just transformed later on. the pictures that I've been publishing are not the actual pictures of the buildings. They're just they're pictures that were of buildings that were transformed in funny ways.
So there was there a lot of thought going into taking the initial photo? It wasn't just a photo to sightsee or a photo with an end in sight. It was a photo to.
That depends. Yeah. I've always had strong connection with the third dimension, with space and with geometry since I was a kid, and buildings, and particularly facades. For me, they have a lot of information with which I can play, and it depends on each building. That building, you see, I say he, you know, it's like a person, you know, it depends on what it says to me, I don't know how, that I will after do the transformation. It's the geometry of the building, you know.
And is it something you see in all buildings or ones of interest, like in every building obviously you probably don't think about this all the time, but has there ever been a building where you just go, I don't feel anything? It's just a form. It's a mass. It's bricks and mortar. It's not angry or sad or quiet or happy or I don't know.
I think that most of the buildings that I picked to do these portraits were buildings that somehow sent me a feeling of abandonment, as if they were sad or forgotten by the people. You know, they are not masterpieces of architecture. They are buildings that, in a way, they somehow look isolated from the surrounding buildings or spaces. So the geometry can be read quite easily, not in all cases, but in most of the cases. High-rise buildings normally were kind of attractive to me, especially if they were located in neighborhoods where the surrounding buildings were not as high.
Is that a practical thing in terms of it's a lot easier to change something when the backdrop is the sky?
Yeah, you have the silhouette of something, and if it's
you can
clean,
see it as an object.
Yeah, you can just exactly see its limits, and then you have empty space around or in front that gives you enough room to play.
That's your portrait. That's your canvas.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. You do quite a lot of painting as well as your 3D rendering. Do you find a piece in your rendering and your Photoshop work, or however you do these images, as you do in painting? You know, I find Photoshop and Revit stressful. It's frustrating. Where painting or drawing, it's peaceful.
For me, both activities are peaceful enough. I mean, working in front of a computer, my body is fit to that since I was 10 years old. I have my arms are somehow deformed into the way I have to move the mouse and stuff like that, and keyboard, etc., etc. We are in a way, because we are growing with computers all over. And with painting, this thing changes completely. But in a way that you start to use other parts of the body that you had forgotten. You know, so the first time I begin to paint, I start to feel some pain in my back or in my elbow or in my fingers, pain that I had never felt before, you know. So after some period of time, your body adapts to it. But both activities, if you create the space, the working space, in a way that you fit in and you feel comfortable, then, I mean, everything can be peaceful. So I enjoy both in different ways. When I'm painting, for example, I have to paint in front of something that is on the wall. So I have to sit in a different way. But I also use a projector, so there's a beam of light projecting behind my back. So the conditions are not the best. But when you are so close to the canvas, and you're grabbing your brush and looking at the stains of color that you're putting on the canvas, then wow, it's an extraordinary, amazing feeling. Because seeing colors actually interact in the real world, it has nothing to do with whatever you can achieve with a computer. So the pleasures are different, and the problems are different. So in a way, it's a matter of just like designing a comfortable space where all your senses feel okay, acoustically, visually, and everything can be beautiful and amazing.
It's interesting to think about when you paint, your eyes zoom in and out, whereas a computer, the screen moves. When you're watching a screen, your eyes don't really do much. They're kind of blanked on the screen, and you move the view. Whereas I find when you paint, you can zoom into a little bit, and then
there's no zoom in when you're painting. Actually, it's completely different experience, and actually
you feel the depth because you're part of the depth. Yeah,
and you feel also, at least it's what I feel, because I experience both ways of putting colors on a surface. You feel how slow it is, because computers, wow, it's like everything's super fast. But when you are used to that speed, then when you go back to painting for the first time in your life, then you see how slow is that, if you want to feel a rectangle with a Greek color, just like grab the rectangle tool and then shift F5 and it's up there. And
if you don't like it, you can undo it.
And you can undo it. But when you paint it, you have to do the same rectangle. You can spend like 4 hours.
And you have to commit to it often.
Yeah,
it's a lot harder to fix.
And it's not as smooth as the digital one. Actually, the most difficult thing that I've been finding in painting is when you try to achieve smoothness. It's super difficult. It's amazingly difficult. So, anyway, it's a completely new experience to me. Actually, I'm painting for already less than a year, and we'll see how it goes.
I like some of them. I like them. The final question I'm going to ask is a question we ask all our guests is, do you have any recommendations for a grand tour? Often when an architecture student will finish his studies, he will tour Europe or the Americas. Is there anywhere you could recommend that's perhaps off the beaten track a bit more, somewhere they might have not seen before? It doesn't need to be inherently a building, but it could be somewhere.
Well, besides the fact that there's a lot of interesting stuff in the world, and besides the stuff that, of course, if we are talking about architects doing the grand tour, there should be architecture at least in those places. But I don't know, from my point of view, there's a lot to learn in vernacular architecture. That architecture made not by architects. Because most of the times, if you go to a place with the frame of the architecture you want to see, you want to find, probably you will find, I guess, similarities with something that you have already studied at school. Rational architecture, you will find examples in that spot. Brutalist architecture, same. It would not be probably the same building that you studied at school, but it will be similar. So maybe the feelings that you will get will not be so overwhelming.
And the lessons maybe won't be as new, perhaps, as well.
Yeah, unless you are kind of young architect that you are really, really interested in a very specific, like for example, constructivism, Russian constructivism in Eastern Ukraine and South Russia. It's an extraordinary place where to go, because most of these buildings are just like run down, and they belong to an age, the communism, that went bankrupt, but all these pieces are still there, and the experience of visiting them is quite different from usual, because you have to they're quite away from one another. It's a lot of miles between. Russia is the biggest country in the world, so maybe it's like 300 kilometers from one bus stop to another bus stop that you want to see, So besides that, I would recommend to explore a little bit of vernacular architecture not made by architects. And actually there is an exhibition and a book that was exhibited in the MoMA in the 60s, 64, by a guy, I think it was Bernd Rudowski or something like that. It was the name of the exhibition was Architecture Without Architects, and it was all about these examples of how things were built, where there were no architects in there. And each country has its own examples. In Spain, there are plenty of stuff like this in the southern area, small villages, or in areas, forgotten areas near the border with Portugal. These are the places that I know most because they're closer to me. Or southern Italy, the city of Matera with all these houses and caves, stuff like that. I think that it could be a very interesting experience. Besides that, the concentration of masterpieces would not be as high as one would expect, but I'm sure that on the way through this vernacular architecture, one could just find other more modern examples of architecture to visit.
Yeah. It's Brian McCall-Lyons, a Canadian architect, once said that he looks at agricultural architecture because it's buildings, it's what they do when they can't afford to get it wrong. So the lessons are true and honest and of a place and not of design.
Yeah.
So it goes back to that kind of thing.
Yeah. And basically trying to visit buildings that are somehow
part of a place
they kept their original.
Yeah.
It's hard to find that, but if you can find the buildings with their original use and with the peoples using them in a similar way than when they were built for the first time, because nowadays architecture is so fluid that you can just with tearing down a couple of walls, you transform a hospital into a cinema, and that's a little bit strange for me. So I don't think this happens with vernacular architecture because mostly it's actually residential.
Mm-hmm. It's on a smaller scale as well. So it's a house and maybe it's turned into an update house. But
Yeah.
It's still a house, yeah.
There's a town near Valencia. It's called Paterna, that has also a very interesting example of houses in caves. Yeah, it's amazing. And actually, the way how people communicate, all the neighbors that lives in there, they communicate to the rooftop.
Oh, wow.
It's one single rooftop that connects all the houses underneath, and it's actually the entry point of the neighborhood. And then you have to go down to your own home through some sort of rock excavated patios and stuff like that.
Some shaded terrace kind of stuff. Huh?
Yeah,
that sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It reminds a little bit of the first Star Wars movie. But it's beautiful because they are actually inhabited by the children or the children's children of those who made them.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor, for your
My
time
pleasure.
today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.
Good. Cheers.
Thank you, Victor, for joining us this week. Our next guest will be Ahmed Belkhoja of Fala Atelier, so make sure you tune in for that. Thank you.